Now it's time for the entrance tower. Even though our composition is strongly symmetrical, the tower is not such an element, as it contains many asymmetrical elements in it. Even its outer shape is somewhat asymmetrical and skewed and widens towards the bottom. The tower has 3 walls, one in shadow, one darkened and one lighter. In the middle of the tower are 3 distinctive window openings. Now we will start to draw a circular shape and a window in the upper part. Before we draw the circle, it's a good idea to start with the square and the diagonals. Notice that the diagonal lines are thinner than the circle because of the two-way perspective. The square is not exactly a square and the circle is a shape like an ellipse. Now we will finish the shapes and the other holes on the entrance tower. We will highlight those shapes and silhouettes that are heavily lit. I'm still mindful of the proportions and the fact that there is another opening behind. While finishing this round shape, which probably contains some kind of clockwork mechanism, remember the line on the center of the circle and its radius. Note that the specific shape of the shadow it gives looks like the moon. This kind of shape is common for round holes and shapes inside some kind of plane. In this topic we will use masking fluid to protect the edges and surfaces that reflects the light the most. These will be mainly the edges of the stones that we have drawn so carefully, especially the upper right corner of these stones. To make it easier to apply such thin lines, you can dilute the masking fluid a bit, try to be precise and apply these lines as thinly as possible. If you make a mistake somewhere, don't panic. Wait until the liquid dries and hardens, then scrape it off and start again. We have finished working on the underlying final watercolor. We can take a closer look at the final result. A list of the colors used in this work. If you don't have a certain color, you can use another one. I encourage you to experiment with colors, but in keeping with the color wheel logic shown in this watercolor. Here is a good for you to prepare your sketches that you made in lesson 1. Because they will be useful to us, also recall the whole process of painting this sketch, as we will be doing very similar painting steps in this main watercolor. If you remember correctly, we just started to the illuminated planes of the walls. And here to use was sepia, natural sienna, and then slowly adding burnt sienna so that a gradient was created. Now I'm adding some burnt sienna, that's why this color is getting warmer. Painting with this technique, with wet paper, we can add more of this color. If we already have a wet wash, we can change the color and modify it. So we have a color transition from sepia mixed with natural sienna, then burnt sienna, and then at the end we add magenta. But it's not because the paint pigment fades, it's just that the wash is no longer wet. We no longer have pigment, water. We will already be mainly painting with the wet on dry technique, that is, on dry paper we will paint various shapes, outlines, like this shadow on the tower. Notice that this shadow is changing its color. I'm changing the color. In the upper left corner it is more blue, there is more cobalt there. Now I'm gradually moving to purple and then I'm adding sepia to the purple. As you can see, I create a gradient similar to the other large gradients on this work that we painted in part 2. Here you can already paint without wetting the paper from underneath, although this is also possible. Then you have to wet the paper from the underneath, wait until it gradually partially sticks. Later you can try spraying the corners, then it will stick again. On the other hand, if you paint on cellulose paper, there is some risk that this large amount of pigment in the corners may wash out a bit. So I encourage you to paint on dry paper already, because the washes you will be applying are not large in an area and will be easy to control without additional moisture. Note that this shadow, the horizontal one on the top of the tower that I painted, also has a gradient color transition. There you can see the transitions from light blue to natural sienna to magenta. There you can see other changing color washes and shadows. Similarly, that Christian moon and that distinctive shadow from that hole where there was once probably some kind of clock mechanism. Also has a transition from such a blue to purple and brown. It's the gradients that make these shadows look much more spacious, and they're also more interesting. Remember that shadows have colors. A shadow is not a black or gray stain, especially in watercolor. Notice also that by changing this shadow, that light shadow, we also get a different spatial perception of these objects. The bottom of the tower seems a little closer, the top of the tower a little further away. On the other hand, notice that this shadow in the depth of this window opening, notice that there I use a slightly different mix for a light shade. There are more warm colors, magenta and sepia, because the shadow on the object, the self-shadow and the self-shadow in the center will look different. If we can see the structure of the stone on the shadow plane, it will appear flatter. Especially in this type of sunset light, when the shadows are not yet so strong, so dark. Whereas the smaller plane shadows are, yes, that's where we won't see the details. Here there is no denying that this stage of painting, the work is a bit of work, and it's good to schedule this work, if there is a lot of it, even for another day. Because there is nothing worse for finishing such shadows. If we try to do it too fast and then we start using the same colors, we don't watch the intensity, we make these shadows too heavy, and then instead of three-dimensional it comes out this effect too graphic. So it's important not to underestimate the stage of the work. Because with too heavy shadows you can lose most of the effect of the whole work even. So it's better to make these shadows a little too pale, and you will be able to enhance them further locally if necessary, than to make them too dark. Well, and see the shadows where there are these bricks fragments in the stone wall. There I use more natural sienna, even with magenta, while where there is stone itself, more than its natural sienna, possibly watered down sepia. Also keep in mind that we're getting higher and higher on the tower, so this color of these shadows on the stones may also change a little bit, as well as this shadow on the side wall, meaning you can try to cool it down a little bit, either by painting already more with a watered down sepia or by adding some blue to this sepia. So it's also useful to think of all those shadows on the tower as also a certain color gradient. And also you can make some of these shadows a little stronger and some a little lighter. Well, and here's a note, I paint these shadows on the stones also in those places where I don't have a pencil under drawing. So this pencil on drawing was a signal to us about proportions, about these most characteristic stones, while at the stage of painting we can, of course, such a texture of the stone wall expand, already painting it in simply with a brush, so it means that we don't have to have all these lines at this stage of the underdrawing. Only as many lines as we need for a correct proportions. Well, here's another bit of the tower where I had a little too much color because I wanted to show just the cloud. So I applied some water and with an artificial hair brush I washed it out, scrubbing it against the surface and using a clean tissue. I washed out some pigment to get back as much of the white of the paper as possible. And then after applying this kind of orange color of the clouds, I was able to fairly get a similar shade and the impression that we have a piece of transparency there, that we can see the sky on the other side. Now I apply stones and bricks in a different color, and also here a caution not to do it with too much contrast. So that the shadows are shadows, but just a color change, so that it's not a drastic transition either. Here I'm also filling in the light of the shadow opening a shadow, and by the way I'm enhancing some of the shadows. The greater the variety of values here, that is from washes that are very bright to such dark, the greater the effect of realism will be. Now we paint in the shadows or change the color of some stones. Changing the color of these stones involves applying a slightly different shade of color to the dry surface. Here you can experiment where you want. As you can see, these bricks appear occasionally here and there. You can also paint the color of this brick in other places than I do in this demo. It is good to assume that we won't paint them in one day, but that it will take at least 2, 3 or even 4 stages. And it's especially important to paint in the details those finishes. Here the painting is not much, but the key is how we do it. If you are not too careful, we will negate some of the effect achieved in the first stages of painting. So I'm still adding here, as you can see, some darkening of the rocks or some holes in the plane, so that it raises the quality of the whole work. But this can be judged by painting out these details on another day. So now I'm darkening some, adding a light shadow somewhere. I make a little stronger darker so that there is more variety of spots. The more values, the more realistic the work is. That is, if we have two values for light, a brighter one and a darker one. Well, and now we have already reached the stage where the work has to dry completely, because we will be removing the masking fluid, and it's only safe to take it off then. If the work is completely dry both from the top layer and from underneath. We have a very strong light on the edges of the stones. It is a little too strong. So now we will try to dim it. And the first step will be to make the clean artificial hair brushes and washing out the edges. That is, you take water, a clean brush with artificial hair brush, and you rub it on those edges. This way you soften these edges, these shapes. They won't be as clear then. At the same time, you can also dim a little. You may also not remove the pigment with a tissue. Then some of them will already be so target darkened right away, and they will take on the right value, the right contrast. This is quite a time-consuming stage, but he will pay off later with very realistic, very interesting 3D effect. At some point, how many of these values you have? From light through shadows. Already at this stage you can compare the fragments which you have already washed out, which have already been partially dimmed, with these that have not yet received the effect. You will see that those that are not yet corrected will see them too graphic, and they will seem not to fit in with this work. On the other hand, we already washed out the stains we needed. We can gently darken some of the whites that are still too strong. And there sometimes dirty water is enough, but it is important that it's dirty in the right color. That is, in the case of stones it's some kind of natural sienna, in the case of bricks it's more of a burnt sienna. And thus we have reached the end. At this point we finish the fourth and final part. The watercolor can now dry and we can take a closer look at the final effect.